high-profile crimes with repeat offenders are putting a spotlight on our bail system. D.C. could be the next to reform it. Who could it help or hurt? From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A. Hi, I'm Jen White. President Trump and Republicans are turning their attention to cashless bail. That's bail reform moving away from a cash system that critics say discriminates against low-income Americans. President Trump earlier this year signed executive orders attempting to end bail reform across the U.S. Now it could be the end of D.C.'s bail system that's been in place since the 90s. How do you think the criminal justice system should handle defendants awaiting trial? Email us at 1a@wamu.org. A look at how the bail system in the U.S. works and where it can improve after this news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. The Trump administration says it will give $12 billion to farmers in the U.S. It's to compensate them for losses incurred because of trade wars and tariffs. From member station KCUR, Frank Morris reports the one-time payment is mostly to farmers who plant crops such as corn and soybeans.
President Trump's trade wars aggravated a bleak equation for U.S. farmers. His tariffs jacked up the prices of the supplies and equipment they need to buy. And retaliatory tariffs cut export sales and drove down grain prices. Many Midwestern farmers lost money this year. Missouri farmer Richard Oswald says the bailout will help cover bills and loan payments, but won't make up for this year's losses.
They're attempting to replace profit with bailout money. It's not the same as having a good market and making a profit.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture says it will distribute bailout funds by March, with row crop farmers taking $11 billion and other farmers splitting another $1 billion. For NPR News, I'm Frank Morris.
President Trump is threatening to impose another 5% tariff on Mexico if it doesn't release more waters for American farmers in the southern U.S. Mexico has argued that it's in the middle of a drought. Indiana state senators have advanced a bill to the full Senate that would redraw Indiana's congressional districts. It's an effort to send more Republicans to the House of Representatives. President Trump has demanded that Indiana Republicans do this to help him. Hundreds of people opposing redistricting crowded outside the Indiana state legislature yesterday in Indianapolis. They chanted, "Stop the steal." Indiana GOP Senate leaders have said there is not enough support to pass the redistricting measure in their chamber. However, it is expected to come up for a vote later this week. Stocks open mixed this morning as the Federal Reserve begins a two-day meeting that's expected to result in lower interest rates. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the Dow Jones Industrial Average jumped about 160 points in early trading.
Investors are fairly confident the central bank will lower its benchmark interest rate by a 0.25 percentage point tomorrow. They'll also be watching what Fed Chairman Jerome Powell and his colleagues have to say about prospects for additional rate cuts in the new year. There's considerable uncertainty as the central bank's trying to keep a lid on both inflation and unemployment. Pepsi is planning to cut jobs and narrow its product lineup by 20% as it works to cut costs and lower prices. The soft drink and snack maker has been under pressure from an activist investor. And computer chip maker NVIDIA has gotten a green light from the White House to sell advanced chips in China. The U.S. government will receive a share of the proceeds. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
You're listening to NPR News from Washington. A federal judge has ruled the Justice Department can publish investigative material from a sex trafficking case against Ghislaine Maxwell. She was the partner of late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The ruling comes after Congress passed a measure last month to publicize Epstein's investigative records. These documents are supposed to be released by December 19th. New polling data from the Pew Research Center show that the religious composition of the United States has changed very little over the last 5 years. NPR's Sarah Ventry reports it also shows there is no clear evidence of a religious revival among young adults.
According to Pew, this stability in religiousness is striking because it comes after decades of religious decline. Though older people tend to be more religious than younger ones, Americans have grown less religious as they've aged. Historically, women have been more religious than men, but this data shows the gender gap in religiousness is closing. But it's not because men are becoming more religious. It's because women are becoming less. The survey shows that 70% of adults in the United States identify with a religion, but only a third of adults attend religious services at least once or twice a month, and 28% of adults identify with no religion at all. Sarah Ventry, NPR News.
Late-night host Jimmy Kimmel says he has extended his contract with ABC for an extra year through May of 2027. The extension comes as President Trump continues to attack Kimmel and other late-night hosts who repeatedly poke fun at him. I'm Corva Coleman, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Progressive Insurance, home of the Name Your Price tool, so drivers can see coverage options at Progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. Price and coverage match limited by state law. And the listeners who support this NPR station.
Good morning. This NPR station is WAMU 88.5. I'm Kellen Quigley. 1A is just ahead. First, a story we are watching. The Supreme Court is considering a Republican-led drive to overturn a quarter-century-old decision and erase limits on how much political parties can spend in coordination with candidates for Congress and president. Follow the case this week here on WAMU 88.5, 25 degrees in Washington.
This is 1A. I'm Jen White. In the debate over crime in the U.S., one centuries-old practice has come front and center: bail. Cash bail is a deposit a defendant can pay to be released after arrest to help guarantee they return for trial. But a handful of states and counties have adopted reforms to address criticism that cash bail punishes those who can't pay. Now, Republicans say these reforms have led to an increase in crime. Data from the FBI released this year shows crime in 2024 fell from the year prior. A video from August of a man stabbing 23-year-old Irina Zarutska to death in Charlotte, North Carolina, reignited the debate. The man was arrested 14 previous times, including earlier this year, but was released without being required to pay bail. Last week, Irina's law went into effect in North Carolina. It eliminates cashless bail for certain offenses. Now D.C. has become the latest battleground. Last month, the House passed bills that would return cash bail to the district, among other more restrictive pretrial policies.
Cashless bail allows dangerous, violent criminals on our streets. For far too long, dangerous criminals have been allowed to roam the streets of Washington, D.C., posing a threat to the general public.
Everyone in this country has seen, and we see it in big cities, and we've certainly seen it in D.C., that these offenders are released to reoffend, and reoffend again.
That was Republican Representative James Comer of Kentucky and U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Jeanine Pirro, amid last month's push to pass these bills. President Donald Trump signed an executive order in August threatening to withhold federal funding from jurisdictions that have adopted bail reform policies.
They kill people and they get out. Cashless bail, they thought it was discriminatory to make people put up money because they just killed 3 people lying on a street. Cashless bail, we're ending it, but we're starting by ending it in D.C., and that we have the right to do through federalization.
Opponents say these moves could lead to jail overcrowding, more plea deals, and upend the lives of those who still have the presumption of innocence. So what do we know about bail reform and its effect on crime? What systems work best to maintain public safety while also protecting the rights of defendants? For that, let's turn to our panel. Mark Levin is the Chief Policy Counsel at the Council on Criminal Justice. That's a nonpartisan think tank. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us in studio is Insha Rahman, the Vice President of Advocacy and Partnership at Vera Institute of Justice. That's an advocacy group aiming to end mass incarceration. Insha, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Michelle Eskenazi is the President of the National Association of Bail Agents. She's also the CEO of Empire Bonding in New York and the President of the New York State Bail Association. Michelle, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
And we're hearing from lots of you already. One member of our text club writes, in Indiana, judges were encouraged to move away from cash bail. The folks arrested for crimes in our rural county are not dangerous for the most part. They suffer from addiction and mental illness. In some instances, they are unhoused. Thoughtful judges and prosecutors can make decisions about who is helped by being able to continue to be in their community while they wait for the resolution of their case. Well, we want to hear your story. If you've had an experience with the cash bail system, share that with us or just share your thoughts. Email us at 1a@wamu.org. I mean, Mark, let's back up quite a bit here. What can you tell us about how the U.S. came to have its current bail system?
Well, what's interesting is before the early 1900s, commercial bail really didn't exist in the United States. And what would happen is if the court wanted to require somebody to put money forward, it would be an amount they could afford. And either they or their family or friends would pull together and pay and get them out of jail. But of course, with commercial bail, what's most common is the person pays only 10% of a much larger total that's put up by a bail bondsman. And the interesting thing is the person doesn't get back the 10% typically, even if they do show up in court. And so what's come to happen is essentially many people languish in jail simply because they cannot afford bail, since there's not an absolute requirement in most jurisdictions that it be an amount they can personally afford. And so that's different from a court saying, making an intentional decision after considering risk assessment and evidence that a person is too dangerous to be released. And so the problem is we have a system that's both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. People who are wealthy and dangerous can buy their way out of jail, while people that are poor but not a danger to the public safety, even sometimes on a $500 bond, they don't have $50. They stay in jail for weeks and months, costing the taxpayers a fortune.
And so when did we start to see the bail reform movement really start to pick up?
So in the 1960s, actually, the federal system was the first to say, here's the problem with money bail, is that it privileges wealth and not public safety. And so it was the first jurisdiction, the federal system, that said, we're not going to use money. We are going to have judges consider public safety first and whether somebody will return to court as the two bases for considering whether somebody stays in jail or is released pending trial. And we saw after the 1960s and the federal system moved in that direction, they had good outcomes. People came back to court, which is what, in theory, an amount of money, skin in the game, is supposed to incentivize. And people stayed safe pre-trial. It turns out money wasn't necessary. A good, smart assessment by a judge about whether somebody can be released or not was. And so we saw Washington, D.C. actually move in that direction in the early 1990s. And interestingly enough, part of the motivation for D.C.'s bail reform to move away from a money bail system was they saw that drug dealers were being able to simply pay a big amount of bail and get out. To Mark's point, it was sort of under-inclusive, right, of like who could get out despite being a threat to public safety. And that's why D.C. moved away from using a money system to one that privileges safety, not wealth. Then we have seen in the past decade, New Jersey, New York, which is much maligned, and I'd like to talk about that at some point. We'll get to that a little later, yeah. Because that's definitely the most controversial of them. And then most recently, Illinois, which completely eliminated cash bail. And what we have seen is, again, when you have a system that privileges safety, not wealth, you actually have better outcomes. But that's not the political debate around it. So there's policy and outcomes on one hand, which have been shown to really work and to privilege the thing that the public cares about, which is safety, when we do bail reform.
Well, we'll talk about New York. We'll also talk about Illinois in a moment. That became the first state to do away with cash bail in 2022. Michelle, the term mainly being used to describe bail reform right now is cashless bail, but you and Insha agree that term is inaccurate. Why?
Well, I mean, anytime you use the word cash surrounding an accountable profession like my own, it denotes a smell like of old fish. So I disagree with the manner in which the talking point is being circulated. So I will often refer to bail as unsecured and secured, which I'm sure that my colleagues would likely appreciate and agree with.
Insha, your thoughts?
So cashless bail is a political talking point by President Trump and the GOP that is really of recent vintage. We're hearing it everywhere. And I tell people, look, there is a political tenor to this. It's not actually accurate. What bail reform does is not a free-for-all. It doesn't let everybody out of jail, to be very, very clear. What it does do is put safety, again, back at the center of decision-making of who is released. When that decision is based on money, then as Mark said, you privilege the wealthy and you punish the poor. What bail reform has done is actually, again, have one system of justice for everyone so that the really rich can't avoid and escape accountability while people who are poor and can't afford, even sometimes a very small amount, end up languishing in jail.
And Michelle, just for clarity, what is the difference between bond and bail?
Well, there's accountability and zero accountability, so that's the inherent difference. And I would be remiss if I didn't change the narrative and change some of these branded talking points that my colleagues have been using for eons. And I would say let's refer to the arraignment and take a look at whether or not that is a crime of moral turpitude. Is there a human victim connected to the crime? The reason why Irina's law passed in North Carolina is because we were talking about a human victim. We weren't talking about blue ideology or bright red ideology. Rather, we were talking about a purple issue, and we were honing in on the victims of crime. In that particular case, it was a young, innocent Ukrainian immigrant to our country. And her dreams were destroyed by a criminal recidivist that suffers emotionally in a disturbed way and should have been held and evaluated psychologically to protect all of us in society, whether or not we are severely liberal or severely MAGA. That is quasi-irrelevant at this point.
Michelle, we can circle back to the fine points of that case, but to my question, for people who are unfamiliar with this system, what is the difference between bail and bond? What are the material differences there?
Well, bail, the pretrial system, is a system that is a taxpayer-funded model, a lot of the times funded by philanthropy through the Arnold Foundation and several Soros foundations. So pretrial is an entity where, by the way, everyone gets paid a salary and doesn't return their salary when the disposition of the case comes up. And then a secured bond is done by my tribe of humans, which are bail agents that are licensed by various departments of insurance throughout the United States of America and essentially live under the regulatory thumb thereof.
Okay, let's pause there. We're speaking to Michelle Eskenazi. She's the president of the National Association of Bail Agents. Also with us, Insha Rahman with the Vera Institute of Justice, and Mark Levin. He's the chief policy counsel at the Council on Criminal Justice. Coming up, we sit down with a professor who's been tracking the effects of these bail reforms in Illinois. And we keep hearing from you. Another member of our text club writes, poor people always have a harder time with the legal system. It's not balanced and not fair. Cash bail is too tempting, a money grab for some local authorities. We'll tackle that later in the hour. This is 1A.
Good morning. 1A continues in just a moment here on WAMU 88.5. The Supreme Court appeared persuaded by the Trump administration's arguments to expand presidential power in firing independent government officials, despite laws meant to insulate them from political pressure. Reporting from the court and analysis today on WAMU 88.5.
In Uganda, a program seeks to address poverty by giving cash and financial coaching to people who need it. Now, funding to global development programs like this are being cut.
If we can find a better way of squeezing more juice out of whatever we're doing, then you can expand and help more people. And instead of going to 1,000 communities, we can go to 2,000 communities.
More on those challenges on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Listen this afternoon on WAMU.
Support for WAMU comes from our members and from the Healthcare Distribution Alliance. whose members are logistics experts, connecting providers and their patients to essential medicines in communities across America. More at hda.org. And from Bayer, committed to developing regenerative agriculture innovations that help farmers increase yields while improving soil health to feed a hungry world. More on Bayer's commitment to American agriculture at Bayer.com.
A bit chilly today, 25 degrees in Washington at 10:20.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Capital One, offering their premium travel card, Venture X. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. Details at CapitalOne.com. From Workday. Workday is an AI platform for forward thinkers, dedicated to transforming the way business leaders manage people, money, and agents today so they can transform tomorrow. Workday, moving business forever forward. And from listeners like you, who donate to this NPR station.
This is 1A. I'm Jen White. We're discussing the latest efforts by President Trump and Republicans to roll back bail reform policies. We're here with Mark Levin. He's the Chief Policy Counsel at the Council on Criminal Justice. That's a nonpartisan think tank. Also with us, Insha Rahman, the Vice President of Advocacy and Partnerships at Vera Institute of Justice. That's an advocacy group aiming to end mass incarceration. And Michelle Eskenazi, the President of the National Association of Bail Agents. She's also the CEO of Empire Bonding in New York and the president of the New York State Bail Association. Mark, before we move on, I just want to circle back to this difference between bail and bond. When people are actually trying to pull money together to pay for a bail, where does that money typically come from?
Yeah, and that would be posting a bond. And typically it comes if they have money themselves or their family. In some jurisdictions, you can also post collateral to the county, which could be like a car title or jewelry or something like that. And that you actually do get back, unlike with the bail bonds. I mean, you lose the 10%, but with collateral, you would at least get that back if you do show up. And one thing I want to point out is that Washington, D.C.'s actually had a great deal of success with their pretrial system, which doesn't rely on money. They have an 89% court appearance rate, a 90% rate of individuals being free of being rearrested during the time they're on pretrial release. And they do quite a bit in terms of pretrial supervision, which means often reporting to it's like reporting to a probation officer, but a pretrial services officer can mean electronic monitoring for those that are high risk, and potentially, of course, being required to go to treatment. I mean, a lot of people on pretrial release have substance use or mental health issues, and one of the things, just making somebody pay money doesn't do anything to address the underlying issues that often brought them into the criminal justice system.
And briefly, does your organization track the degree to which third-party organizations, philanthropy, is supporting people's efforts to post bond?
Well, I think what was being referred to is the bail funds that became popular after the murder of George Floyd in particular, and what essentially they kind of do more or less the same thing that bail bondsmen do, because they put up money for somebody, and the only way the bail fund kind of can keep operating is if the person shows up, because then the money's returned, at least all but 10% if they operated like a bail bondsman, but they don't. They're nonprofit, so basically the person's never out any money, so they're not even out the 10%. But of course, the fund would lose 100% theoretically if the person doesn't show up. It certainly. I think that most of the people that have been, or perhaps all of them that have kind of started and run bail funds don't believe we should be using money to decide who stays in jail and who's released. And so I think it was really kind of an attempt in some ways to show that the arbitrariness of the system and the need to move to a system based on risk and public safety.
Well, I want to turn now to Don Steeman. He's the co-director of Loyola University Chicago's Center for Criminal Justice. Don, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, in 2022, Illinois became the first state to do away with cash bail. That law went into effect in 2023. What specific changes were put in place?
So what most people take away from it was the elimination of monetary bail. So Illinois no longer has a monetary bail system, so people don't have to post money to be released. But what the law did was fundamentally change the procedures for determining who should be detained pretrial and who should be released. It made the decision more substantive and required several things to happen. So first, it requires prosecutors to file a petition to detain for those people who they believe either pose a threat to public safety or a risk of willful flight. And then it requires a judge to make a determination after that the person indeed poses a threat to public safety or a risk of flight and that no other conditions can mitigate those risks. But it does a couple other things too. It limits the offenses that are eligible for detention so that those individuals who are arrested for offenses that are detainable under the public safety consideration, those include violent felonies, felonies that are non-probationable, weapons offenses, and domestic violence offenses. And then another group of offenses that are only detainable for willful flight considerations, which are primarily other felonies. And then it lists a group of offenses that cannot be detained, so low-level felonies and all misdemeanors that are non-domestic violence. But it does one other thing, too. It requires that defendants be represented by counsel at those initial hearings, which wasn't happening in Illinois under the cash bail system.
Mm-hmm. So you've been tracking the effects of these changes. What have you found, especially when it comes to its effect on crime rates and how often defendants return for trial?
Sure. We found no change in crime rates after the implementation of bail reform in Illinois. Like most states, crime has been decreasing. It decreased last year. It continues to go down in 2025. So there's been no impact on crime that we've seen. For appearance rates, we've seen some increase in failure to appear rates, but for very specific individuals. The law also allows police to use citations or notices to appear for some offenses. And what we've seen is individuals who receive notices to appear, there's been an increase in failure to appear rates for those individuals. But for others, failure to appear rates have remained pretty stable after the law. And we've seen no increase in new criminal activity of those who've been released. So a very small percentage of people commit offenses while in pretrial release. That was true under monetary bail, and it remains true after bail reform.
You also examined how bail reform affects funding streams for local communities. In some cases, municipalities retain some of the cash bail funds. What did you find in Illinois?
So under the monetary bail system in Illinois, defendants posted about $140 million a year in bail. Under the old system, counties were allowed to keep 10% of the amount that was posted. So in most years, they kept about $14 million that was paid by defendants for bail. That was used to fund local court systems. So that money now is gone from counties. However, the state has replaced some of that with a couple things. So one is that many counties in Illinois didn't have any pretrial services. So most people who were released pretrial in most of Illinois received no supervision. The state created an Office of Statewide Pretrial Services that now provides that for counties. And it also appropriated money for public defense. So as I said before, many people under the old bail system weren't represented by counsel during their bail hearings. Now with the statewide funding, all defendants not only have to be provided counsel, but what we're seeing is that they now have the ability, those counties have the ability to provide counsel for full-time public defenders.
Well, last month, President Trump turned his focus to Chicago after a high-profile incident on the city's L train. A man allegedly set a woman on fire in an unprovoked attack. She's in critical condition.
They burned this beautiful woman riding in a train. A man was arrested 72 times. 72 times, think of that. And they'll let him out again. The liberal judges will let him out again.
Now, Don, the suspect in this case did have 72 prior arrests. Under Illinois' current system, is there a number of prior arrests that automatically triggers a jail hold?
There's not. Prior arrests alone can't be used as a determination for a public safety threat.
So the suspect in this case has been charged with a federal terrorism offense. He's not yet gone to trial. His prior arrests include driving on a suspended license and battery. What do you make of this case as it's working or as it's playing out within this broader system of change in the state?
Well, I think it's a horrible incident, and I think the first thing it indicates is that the person who committed this, clearly had mental health issues that were not being addressed by the system. I'll say this about Illinois' bail reform. This person did have a petition to detain filed by the prosecutor's office. The judge chose not to detain. But under the current system, if the person had been detained, what the new system allows for is that person to be detained until the disposition of their case. Under the cash bail system before, if this person had monetary bail imposed, there's nothing to say that they wouldn't have been able to post it. The bail reforms in Illinois, when there is a clear public safety threat that's proven by the prosecutor during pretrial and found by the judge, that individual is detained and then detained until their case is disposed.
So I just want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. If the prior system of cash bail or monetary bail was in place in Illinois, there's no guarantee this person would have been held due to a prior arrest if they were able to pay that bail.
Correct. In most instances in Illinois, cash bail was the main outcome in bond court hearings. It was very rare that people were held for preventive detention reasons under the cash bail system. Almost everybody had monetary bail imposed.
Now, you know that often these bail decisions by judges are short, sometimes only taking 2 to 3 minutes. Why?
Under the monetary bail system, that was true. I think it wasn't a very substantive hearing. I think what was happening in most instances was that judges were imposing the same bail amount for individuals charged with the same offense, so that somebody came through, the automatic default was $5,000 or $10,000, depending on the offense. Under the bail reforms in Illinois, the detention hearing, that decision to detain or release an individual, those hearings take now 15 to 20 minutes. We've seen some take as long as an hour. It's a much more substantive, deliberative decision about who should be detained pre-trial than we had under the bail system.
So you have a body of data now that you can examine in Illinois. When you look at that data, what sorts of changes would you like to see within the criminal justice system to make pre-trial policies both fair and effective?
I think the availability of pretrial services has significantly changed things in Illinois. It's now possible in rural parts of the state to try to get people services that they might need to ensure that they can come back to court, that they get reminders to come back to court, and that they get the help they need. In the past, many people who were released pretrial got no services and no supervision, and I think that's one of the very positive changes that's come out of the law.
That's Don Steeman. He's the co-director of Loyola University Chicago's Center for Criminal Justice. Don, thanks for your insights.
Thank you.
I'm Jen White. You're listening to 1A. And we're still here with Mark Levin, the Chief Policy Counsel at the Council on Criminal Justice, and Shahraman with the Vera Institute of Justice, and Michelle Eskenazi, the President of the National Association of Bail Agents. Mark, we heard about the effects of bail reform on crime in Illinois. What else would you like to add about what we're learning from looking at that state?
Well, I think that Illinois actually learned quite a bit from New Jersey, which had a very positive experience. They enacted bail reform under when Chris Christie was governor, bipartisan effort. And one of the things I think Illinois learned from New Jersey was the importance of investing resources in training and technology and pretrial supervision and services, as Don said. And, you know, New Jersey put in $10 million to do things like that, including court reminders. Text reminders for people to come to court, which many studies have shown are incredibly effective and cost almost nothing to provide. During the pandemic, when most pretrial hearings were virtual, there were almost no failures to appear, which demonstrated that the research was correct in the sense that most people who miss a court date, it's because they're sick, they're can't find childcare or transportation. It's not an intentional effort to abscond from justice. And so these court reminders, particularly those that include information about transportation and childcare, are very effective. And we could even go beyond that and enable people to either on an online portal or using an app to reschedule their court hearings if they are sick, for example, to also help them connect with treatment and resources in the community, job training, job placement. The pretrial process can take many months, sometimes more than a year before a case is resolved. And so that's why trying to front load the resources and actually deal with the issues that brought somebody into the criminal justice system in the pretrial phase, it's so important, because then once you do get to the adjudication or the plea bargain, perhaps their issue, whether it was an overdose or a mental health episode, perhaps it's already been solved because they were connected to treatment during that pretrial process.
Well, that brings us to a text that we've gotten, and it echoes what we're hearing from a lot of listeners. This person shares, "It bothers me that people are incarcerated before they are tried. Now, in the U.S., we have a presumption of innocence until proven guilty. If people have not been convicted of a crime but cannot pay bail, to what degree does this detaining them conflict with that principle?" And Ensha and Michelle, I'd like to hear both of your thoughts. Ensha?
Sure. I got my legal start as a public defender in the Bronx, and so I represented thousands of people. And the reason that they had me as their lawyers, they simply didn't have money to pay for a lawyer. They certainly didn't have money for bail. And what we know about the cash bail system is that because of many different factors, we find that people of color are arrested more than white people, even for the same crime. When they're in front of a judge, judges, either knowingly or unknowingly end up setting bail more often for black and brown defendants and end up setting bail at higher amounts, which people can't pay. And so the fact that money is the determining factor essentially exacerbates a lot of flaws, a lot of bias in the system, and it amplifies it, and the impact is very real. What we have seen from the research, and certainly what I saw from my experience in court as an attorney, was if somebody had bail set and they couldn't pay it and they stayed in jail, they pled guilty. They pled guilty as fast as they could, not because they necessarily were guilty, but it was the only way for them to get home, to get back to their jobs, to get back to their children, their families. And that is not the incentives we want in a system that at the end of the day is supposed to deliver safety, it's supposed to deliver accountability, it's supposed to deliver justice. It does none of those.
Michelle, your thoughts?
Well, I have two thoughts. And the first one, I guess I'll refer to is New Jersey, and that one of the things that my colleagues failed to explain to your listeners is that in the state of New Jersey, whereby they practice preventative detention, which ironically they do that in China and Iraq, is that you're held incarcerated with no chance of bail. And the state of New Jersey changed under former Governor Chris Christie their constitution. So if your son goes to Rutgers and he's accused of a date rape and the judge deems him dangerous, he's held through trial with no chance of bail. You have no right to bail in New Jersey. And as it pertains to legal aid and the cost of these arraignments, and they keep referring to cost, the fact of the matter is it's very simple to cure this issue, and that would be quantification of indigence. No one should be able to get into the arraignment box in the Bronx, for example, and say to Your Honor, I'm indigent. Years ago in Nassau County, they used to have...
Michelle, I'm going to pause here. We're coming up against a break. We'll pick up the conversation then. We're speaking to Michelle Eskenazi, Ensha Rahman, and Mark Levin about changes to the bail system, and we'll be right back.
Good morning. You are listening to 1A on WAMU 88.5. Coming up in about 20 minutes on 1A. Every day, tens of millions of people play New York Times games like Wordle, Connections, and the Crossword. What's happening behind the scenes? It's Ask a Puzzle Maker. That's today at 11 with Jen White and 1A. Keep listening for that here on WAMU 88.5.
Lawmakers, activists, professors, musicians, scientists, parents, friends, and neighbors. Hear from them all weekday mornings on Morning Edition from NPR News.
Listen weekday mornings on WAMU 88.5.
Support for WAMU comes from our members and from Leidos. At Leidos, they believe a brilliant mind is smart, but a brilliant team is smarter. That's why they collaborate to create even smarter technology solutions in national security and health. Leidos, making smart smarter. And from the Good Feet store. Good Feet arch supports are immediately available and are designed to relieve pain with no shots, no surgery, and no medication. Test walk and fittings are available today at goodfeet.com.
Currently 25 degrees in Washington, 23 degrees in Germantown, and 23 degrees in Reston at 1040.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Storyworth. Each week, Storyworth emails a loved one a question about their life. After a year, Storyworth will publish their stories and color photos into a book to keep for generations. Learn more at storyworth.com. And from BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy and helping clients find balance. Clients are matched with one of 30,000 therapists for online therapy from anywhere at betterhelp.com/public. This is NPR.
Back to our conversation in a moment, but first a word about what's coming up on Thursday. The Trump administration's trade policy has made 2025 a chaotic, uncertain year for the U.S. economy, for consumers facing inflation and cost of living challenges, and for businesses trying to figure out when to resupply their warehouses or what prices to charge to stay afloat. Despite all that, U.S. shoppers spent 4% more on Black Friday than last year, both online and in stores. We'll unpack what signals in the economy tell us about the impact of tariffs this year and what the economic outlook is for the start of 2026. And we want to hear from you. How do you feel spending money this holiday season? How would you describe your finances now that 2025 is almost over? Call 855-236-1A1A. What do you want to know about the economy in the new year? Leave us a voicemail at 855-236-1212 or talk to us using our app, 1A Vox Pop, and we'll share your thoughts and questions on Thursday. Now back to our discussion about the push to roll back bail reforms by President Trump and Republicans. We're here with Mark Levin. He's the Chief Policy Counsel at the Council on Criminal Justice. That's a nonpartisan think tank. Insha Rahman is also with us, the Vice President of Advocacy and Partnerships at Vera Institute of Justice. That's an advocacy group aiming to end mass incarceration. And Michelle Eskenazi, the President of the National Association of Bail Agents. She's also the CEO of Empire Bonding in New York and the President of the New York State Bail Association. We're also hearing from you. Dan in New Hampshire emails, placing bail at a level a defendant cannot reasonably afford seems to be just a way to deny bail without saying you're denying bail. So when the government asserts that dangerous people are on the street because bail is too low, that's misleading and dishonest. Michelle, I want to pick up the conversation with you. You were referring to New Jersey's changes. They eliminated cash bail in that state. Please go ahead.
Well, what a lot of people don't know is a simple Google search. If you take a look at the New Jersey weed man, he was the first political prisoner in the state of New Jersey. He's a honorably discharged United States Marine and African American that was held for 447 days because of witness tampering. And he's also a Democrat, by the way. Anyway, the New Jersey weed man could not obtain bail because in the state of New Jersey, even though I offered the state a $2 million bond to procure his release, they cannot take a bond to procure his release because of preventative detention. And it's a conversation that is not a popular one, again, like some of the other ones that I bring up. But it is important that the arraignment levels stay with judicial discretion and that the legislative branch be stopped from constantly changing the bench and the way that they arraign. If the bench can make decisions about custody and probate and massive issues throughout the day in the United States of America, surely a judicial officer can make an arraignment recommendation, and no one should be subject to just one form of bail through these massive government bureaucracies, of which my colleagues mentioned. My fugitive recovery arm and the bail agents throughout the United States of America do an amazing job at bringing an accused back to court to make a victim whole. And that's a conversation and a narrative that's not particularly popular in this conversation about bail reforms.
Michelle, I have to note that you, when we started our conversation, you said that this should not be a partisan issue. But twice now, you've brought up the political affiliation of a defendant, Democrat. You said that George Soros was funding, I suppose, bail nonprofits. And I'm just curious, if this is a nonpartisan issue to your mind, why are those relevant? I can't even call them facts. I don't know that the Soros story is true. I don't know where you're getting that bit of information, but why do you think those are relevant in this conversation?
Well, I mean, I think just like my grandmother used to say, why is a crooked letter? I mean, inquiring minds want to know. We're having a conversation. Everyone has a different side of the conversation. And my experience in the criminal justice system is 3 decades long. And what I'm bringing to the conversation are my thoughts, my opinions, many of which are factual, can certainly be Googled, certainly, including the 447 days incarceration by Edward Fortune, who was, like I said, the first political prisoner subject to Governor Christie's Bail Reform Act in the state of New Jersey, none of which is particularly quantified properly. Failure to appear is not quantified properly. And, you know, there are many facets of bail reform that are not. And certainly willing to always have the conversation with the other side, because we certainly don't believe anyone should languish. We make these types of referrals to drug programs and domestic violence shelters to various accused throughout the nation. And that's not a service that we're being paid for. It's part of the heart of every secured bail agent throughout the United States of America, many of which are Black, brown, and LGBTQ.
But in your answer there again, the political relevance that you raised about George Soros, that's a well-known right-wing talking point. I'm not understanding that connection.
Well, I'm certainly sorry that you don't understand the connection. However, it is, you know, in my estimation, a valuable point that these massive nonprofits and these billionaires are funding the other side of an issue, whether it be bail or farming. It's, you know, the fact of the matter is it's what goes on. And like I said, these issues are purple. When a criminal perpetrator picks their next victim on the New York subway platform, they don't look at that victim and go, is she right wing or left wing? They simply go ahead and and commit crime of moral turpitude. And that's a part of the conversation that's much bigger, however, should be inclusive as it pertains to bail reform.
Well, Insha, I want to bring you in here because we should also mention that the commercial bail industry, which again is unique to the U.S., it's a $2 billion a year industry. That's according to the Brennan Center for Justice. How does the U.S. system differ to others we see around the world?
I'm so glad you asked that, because one thing listeners should know is that the U.S. is one of 2 countries in the entire world that not only has a cash bail system, but allows for the bail bond industry to turn a profit of $2 billion a year, which is a lot of money. And so when Michelle is talking about the work that bail bond agents do, I think it is problematic that she hasn't acknowledged that there is a financial incentive for the bail bond industry, and that not only do they turn a profit over what should be a public good, which is public safety and the court decision of releasing people or keeping them in jail pending trial, but also that they have a financial incentive to keep their business, their for-profit business going. And so they give a lot of money in donations to elected officials on the campaign trail who are running for office. They give donations to judges who are in this country, mostly elected, to prosecutors, to police chiefs and others. So one of the things we have to talk about here is motives. And for proponents of bail reform, our motive is safety and more justice. For the bail bond industry, their motive is money. And for opponents of bail reform, I'd say their motives are politics, because crime is an issue that is truly nonpartisan. We all want to be safe, and yet it is an issue that is so easily weaponized because it has such a strong emotional tenor.
Well, we're hearing from our listeners. Stephen emails, if you think cashless bail lets dangerous people out on the streets, then you should realize that cash bail also lets dangerous people out on the streets. The amount of money you have doesn't change your dangerousness. And we got this from Michael in Tennessee, who says, can we ask the panel how many tragedies like that in North Carolina are an acceptable level? Is there a way to make judges accountable when a defendant that they have released on no or minimal bail offends again? Mark, I'm going to hear from you on this first, because you're tracking bail reform across the country. Is there that kind of accountability built in where states are taking on bail reform?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly it's important to have public, transparent data about pretrial outcomes. And of course, there's going to be failures, but we owe it to the public to do everything we can to reduce the risk of that, and that is really why it's important to use objective instruments to assess somebody's risk. And of course, ultimately, the judge makes the decision, but they should have the most information in front of them about that individual's background, including prior serious offenses, including any prior instances of absconding. One thing I do want to correct is regarding New Jersey. After they implemented bail reform under Chris Christie, there was a 44% drop in the jail population. So citing an anecdote about one person, I think, is misleading. They also had really good public safety outcomes. There was no increase in crime or failure to appear or new offenses by people on pretrial release. So I think that what it boils down to really is, do we want a system that's based on how much money somebody has, or do we want a system where the court decides should somebody stay in or be released prior to trial with the of course, we need to remind people the default should be released, sometimes with conditions like pretrial supervision, electronic monitoring, et cetera. But it was former Chief Justice William Rehnquist who said the presumption should be a pretrial release because we presume people are innocent. But there are cases where an objective assessment indicates, serial killers, somebody who just, committed an act of domestic violence where, a spouse, for example, or somebody could be a specific person, not to mention the public, could be at grave risk if they were released. So there are those cases. And in those instances, the person should be denied bail, regardless of how much money they have. So that's really the crux of it.
We're talking to Mark Levin. He's the Chief Policy Counsel at the Council on Criminal Justice. Also with us, Insha Rahman with the Vera Institute of Justice, and Michelle Eskenazi, the President of the National Association of Bail Agents. I'm Jen White. You're listening to 1A. We also heard from Mia, who emails, please mention that personal recognizance, meaning release without payment of money, is an option for people who do not pose a danger to the public. Mark, what sort of alternatives are we seeing put in place of cash bail across the country, with the understanding that these reforms look different from state to state?
Sure. Well, for the lowest risk individuals, release on personal recognizance, basically somebody signing a piece of paper saying they're going to come back to court, makes sense. Obviously, the text reminders we talked about earlier to make sure people, it's on the top of their radar screen that they need to be in court. I think the other thing is we haven't talked about at all is deflection and diversion. So the system is overloaded. And so one of the things that we talked about earlier, if somebody's having an overdose or a mental health episode, well, if the police have somewhere else to bring somebody besides the jail, like a 24-hour crisis center in San Antonio for people with mental health distress, then we never get to the issue of bail because they're diverted from the jail to begin with and brought to a place that could be more appropriate for somebody where there's not a public safety issue, but there is an issue in terms of homeless person who's, public trespass is another example. But many of these cases, in many jurisdictions, police officers are now have a broader toolbox where they can divert those individuals entirely from jail so that when we're talking about pretrial justice, we can actually get the system to process cases more quickly so people aren't on pretrial release for for a year or more because we've weeded out these lowest level cases, which really require treatment and services as opposed to prosecution.
Well, we have just a couple of minutes left here. And Michelle and Sham, I'm curious to hear from each of you what you hope listeners keep in mind as this debate continues to play out across the country. Michelle, I'll come to you first.
Thank you so much. What I believe is that we need to have more of these extremely valuable conversations from all the sides that represent this particular four-letter word. It's so incredibly important that people understand what the right to bail is. There really shouldn't be just one particular, let's say, brand of bail. There should be a vast array of opportunities for anyone to reach liberty. And it doesn't mean that there's only one way. And I think that, again, it's really important. And I'm a domestic violence survivor, so I can say this. It's really important that going into 2026, that we start putting the victim conversation and the bail conversation together like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Ansha?
Well, I don't know about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I don't like them that much. But Michelle and I absolutely agree that we need a bail system that prioritizes the safety of victims and prevents a tragedy from happening again. What happened on the commuter rail train in Charlotte and the train in Chicago are tragedies to two innocent victims. But let's be very clear, when those moments happen, the right response is not to fearmonger about so-called cashless bail. The right response is to do what the medical profession does. When something goes wrong, they have case rounds. They literally get together and say, what went wrong here? And in both of those cases, they were men who had cycled through the system, who had gotten out before, who had paid bail before and been there dozens of times. And they didn't actually get the mental health intervention that they needed that would have kept the public safe. And so there are other options, and we need to actually be clear-headed and objective about what would have actually prevented this particular tragedy from happening. Because if you blame the wrong causes of crime, you miss the right solutions. And blaming bail reform is just simply the wrong cause. We have to find the right solutions.
Mark, very briefly, what are you watching as this House bill overhauling the D.C. criminal justice system makes its way through the Senate, and as other local governments consider similar legislation too? Very briefly.
Well, I think that the most important thing we're watching really is to make sure, as Insha said, we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We really need to distinguish between those who are serious, the most serious defendants of those serious crimes with the highest risk level who may need to be detained, and making sure we get the other folks out of jail, because when someone's detained who's low risk, they lose their job, they lose their place to live, their car's impounded, and they actually become a higher risk.
Well, we'll leave the conversation there for now and continue to cover this story. That's Mark Levin. He's the Chief Policy Counsel at the Council on Criminal Justice, a nonpartisan think tank. Also with us, Insha Harman, the Vice President of the Advocacy and Partnerships at Vera Institute of Justice. That's an advocacy group aiming to end mass incarceration. And Michelle Eskenazi, the President of the National Association of Bail Agents. She's also the CEO of Empire Bonding in New York and the President of the New York State Bail Association. Thanks to you all. Today's producer was Michelle Harvin. This program comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Jen White. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again tomorrow. This is 1A.